finally we can get to the good stuff, right? We've been swimming slow all season, training real hard, and basically the whole time your body is like fighting you, right? Every workout you do, you break the body down and it's fighting you, trying to recover and repair and improve. But now finally we're actually going to let the body fully recover, fully repair, super compensate, and then we're going to take advantage and try to swim real fast. So it should be a pretty short talk. We're just going to go through the day-by-day changes that happen during taper. I think there's a lot of mystery and confusion and a lot of feelings that go up and down, and some people get kind of scared by them, so we want to explain those at least as best we can and make sure we understand what's going on with our bodies. And then we'll quickly talk about some different types of taper, right? Because you're not going to do like a mid-season taper and late season and taking advantage of those things. I think first let's start with describing what taper actually looks like. So I think we mentioned before, but we can say it again. The workout volume goes down, but the intensity really shouldn't. And they did the studies with track athletes where they put some of them on a slightly decreased volume taper, and the other group they cut their volume by 90%, but they had them do very high intensity workouts, and that group actually did phenomenally better than the group that maintained, even though they came down on volume, they still maintained quite a bit. And actually that first group, the group that maintained their volume, they didn't do any better than a control group that just sat out for 2 weeks. So the volume goes down, the body over recovers, and we want to try to take advantage of that. So, just some quick numbers here. You might be going from 9 workouts to 5, you might be going from 8,000 yards to 3,000, but, pace sets, we still want to do them the same way. We want high intensity, but we just want to cut the volume down. So instead of doing 20, we might just do 5, and we might even give some extra rest to maybe get our speed up. So that's kind of what taper looks like, right? When your coach starts it, or what you're working towards, right? You may not go straight from that to that, but throughout taper, let's take a look biologically and see what's going on. So the first few days are all going to be about glycogen regeneration. So remember that glycogen is the sugar stores in your muscles, and when you have high rates of training, you're constantly burning that sugar. So your sugar's chronically kind of low, right? You might get some good recovery on weekends, but then you hit it hard during the week. And then of course during taper, your training goes down, so you're not burning nearly as much fuel all the time, and so your glycogen stores go way up, right? So some of the testing that they had done, they showed that glycogen can improve 35%. Now, of course, this causes a problem, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. So something called the taper blues. So if you've never had the taper blues or never experienced, here's what it is. Basically, it's a few days during the beginning of taper where you really feel like absolute garbage. Muscles are super tight, super heavy, performance goes way down. It can be a really scary time in a swimmer because it starts within the first few days of taper, and swimmers tend to overreact, and they think, oh wow, I spent all season training and all of a sudden I'm super slow, I'm never going to get fast, and it's all over, right? So they give up. So can we explain what the taper blues actually are? Well, I don't know if this is quite proven, but to me this is the logic that makes sense. So sugar is very wet and very heavy, right? That's why you only can store about 40 minutes worth of glycogen in your muscles at maximum. With every gram of glycogen or every gram of sugar that you store comes with it 3 grams of water, right? And fat doesn't have this. That's why fat is the preferred storage mechanism of your body. So when you go from having chronically low sugar stores, that means your water content is really low and it's not taking that much space, and now all of a sudden you've maxed out your sugar and the water content is really high, it swells up the muscles and if that of course makes them really tight and makes them really heavy. And at the same time, what I also think happens is that because you have so much sugar, you can really fuel the glycolysis machine a lot easier, and so you get a lot more acid production from that, so that's why your performance tends to go down. Now, the important thing to realize is that this is totally normal and expected, right? After a few days, things start to equalize and your muscles will kind of slowly adapt. Maybe, your body's always adapting, right? So even to this change, it adapts, and after a few days, things get better, and then you can start really seeing the benefits and improvements of taper. The key thing here is just to remember that taper blues are totally temporary. Don't change anything that you're doing. Keep doing your high intensity stuff and lower volumes. Keep having good nutrition, sleeping a lot, stretching a little bit, and just trust that it's just temporary and it'll all be over soon. So by days 7 and 10, we've kind of maxed out our muscle repair. So during the season, during dry land, especially using a lot of equipment like paddles and fins, we've really done a job tearing up our muscles almost on a daily basis, right? And if your muscle is torn or broken, it's not going to work. It's not going to be involved in producing motion. And during the season, you kind of rotate through your muscle fibers, right? You're not going to break them all down at the same time. You're going to break a few at a time, and the rest have to pick up the slack. But usually by day 7, or maybe 10, if you extend it out, most of the muscle cells have returned back to normal. And so now we actually have way more muscle cells that are actually functioning, and not just ones that are fully loaded on fuel. And of course, this leads to better performance, right? Now finally we're using 100% of the muscles that we carry around and lug around, whereas in the past we were probably using, I can make up a number, nobody really knows, but you were using less than 100%. And of course, when we go to taper and championship meet, we want everything working. So after day 10, improvements continue, but we don't actually know why. I'm sure there's speculation, but really we don't know exactly what the signals are that keep things going up, but we do know the numbers at least, so we can go through those. At maximum speeds, they've noticed that lactate levels can be lower, 13% lower, and remember that lactate is a surrogate for acid and hydrogen buildup. So the lower your lactate levels can stay, the lower your acid, the more you can maintain that speed for a longer period of time. And then same with sub maximum speeds. So putting in swimming terms, anything in a 200 race or above, lactate levels are lower in that too, which of course means that you can push them up higher and increase your speed. When they tested people at sub-maximum speeds during taper, they found that their VO2 and their heart rate were lower. So what that means is that to go the same sub-maximum speed in season versus at taper, their stroke itself was actually more efficient. So they had improved distance per stroke, and their body was working more efficiently. So they had improved power to drag ratio, even though they probably didn't necessarily change that much, technique wise. And then all the way out to 14 days, they did some testing, and they noticed that both the slow twitch and the fast twitch fibers contracted faster and more powerfully. So that's probably where there's probably a little more repair going on. But I think this might, it's kind of difficult to tell, but this might be software changes getting unlocked further to allow us for better performance. And then the last thing is we kind of take care of our chronic dehydration, so blood volume goes up, and then red blood cell mass, so the number of hemoglobin, or how much hemoglobin you have, goes up. So that's going to relate to that VO2 max change, and that increases about 10% each too. So all these things, they keep improving and improving after that 10th day, and this is for like elite high-end athletes, right? We're not talking like 9-10-year-olds here. 9-10-year-olds taper is all psychological, but the older you get, the more these numbers start to matter. And then, of course, everyone's favorite activity during taper is shaving. So they did the test here too. So obviously we have less drag, so your gliding is going to be better, your distance per stroke is going to be better, efficiency goes up. And I think there's a couple reasons for this. Obviously, hair, and we'll talk in part 3 about the physics of swimming and how shaving helps in that respect with things like skin drag and the boundary layer, this and that. But long story short, you basically pull less water along with you than you were unshaved. And the other thing that I think that happens that people don't necessarily talk about is that when you're unshaved, when your arm enters the water, really all the little hairs catch bubbles, right? And so that prevents really good contact with the water, and you end up pulling more air than water. But when you shave, you can get rid of all those bubbles and you get good contact with the water, so your grip actually gets better. So not only do you have decreased drag, but at least in my opinion, you have better power output as well. I think in the past this used to be more of a debate, but now everybody's kind of agreed what kind of taper is the best. So there used to be this question like, how should we change our training during taper? Should we decrease the intensity and let the body fully recover, or should we decrease volume and maintain intensity and maintain really hard, heavy workouts just for a much shorter period of time? So actually the best experiment that was done was in track runners. So they took 2 groups, and actually there was a control group which did nothing. They didn't do any workouts for the taper time, so they were just as trained, just as athletic as the other 2 groups, but then they stopped doing anything. But then one group decreased their volume by 65%, and they did no intensity work. So everything was at submaximal speeds. Everything was, they kept things under control the whole time. And then the second group brought their volume down even more, 90%, huge drop in volume, but they maintained their intensity quite high. Almost everything they did was at their high, at maximum or near maximum speed. I think they were doing 90% efforts. So the low intensity group did not improve and actually did just as good as the control group, which just sat around doing nothing. And the high intensity group improved 2 to 3%, which is actually right around what you should expect for any good taper or any good seasonal improvement. You should expect 2 to 3% if everything works just great. So, in essence, this really proved, and I think people have learned over the years, that you really have to maintain that speed and pace work. I've had swimmers fight me back on this, and they take the whole taper off and they go to do their races, and it's not good at all, and everybody else is doing great. So you don't want to be that swimmer. You have to trust the system, and even here we can see that there's actual science behind it. So you definitely don't want to do things like this, 10-100 easy swimming for your entire taper. Here and there, obviously, that's fine, but you want to maintain intensity and focus on decreasing your volume, but maintaining your speed or even increasing it. So I think most of us are familiar with in-season meets versus championship meets, and that we definitely expect to perform differently. We expect to taper differently for those kind of things. So we'll start with a minor taper here. So that's for like your mid-season meet. So it's shorter, 5-7 days, maybe even less. I know on the club scene we might go down to 2 or 3 days. And really what we're trying to do is just take advantage of the first few things that happen in taper. So refueling, rebuilding, rehydrating, getting all those quick changes to happen, and then we go and re-race for a weekend. Usually, training, coaches have a periodization flow through their workouts. So sometimes they have hard weeks, tough that lead into, you know, recovery weeks. So a minor taper really lines up well with like a recovery week and then into a weekend swim meet. A lot of times this will be called a drop taper. We'll actually go through, there's a little bit specific language that goes with drop taper, so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But you know, obviously this is a type of taper that we do 2 or 3 times in season to try to maximize what we can do on a weekend. Whereas a major taper is where we really go all out. So that's like going to be our 10 to 14 days. You know, some of these sprinters on the high-end groups will take up to 14 weeks to do this whole taper, and this is going to be an end-of-season thing. Once we're done with our swim meet, we're taking a few weeks off, stuff like this. And the big difference, the reason I bring these up, the big difference between a major taper and a minor taper is here. In a major taper, you're actually going to be losing your endurance adaptations, right? That's why you need that time off, and that's why if you come back to training after a major taper, you have to kind of start back slow. So why is that? Well, if you look at the graph here, so training intensity, obviously we've hit kind of our peak, and then we're going to spend, what, like 2 weeks decreasing our volume, right? We maintain our intensity, but we decrease our volume to kind of overcompensate. And all that endurance training, remember, if we go back to our endurance training talk, the first one we did in part 1, mitochondria, VO2, blood volume, heart size, they're not going to go away right away, but they are going to start. But if you don't stimulate them and you don't work them, you'll lose them. So that's why major tapers you can't do for every swim meet, obviously. So we save these for major events once or twice a year, right? So the rule of thumb that I like to think about is that it takes about 2 weeks to do the taper, and then the window to swim fast lasts about another 2 weeks. So a lot of people try to think, you know, they think taper is all about hitting that peak performance on a single day. I really don't think that's the right way to think about it. Your body's not going to change that much day to day unless you like ran a marathon. But all of our swimming events, even the mile, is relatively a short race. So you know, you're not going to peak on one day and then the rest of it you're going to peter out. Your body is really kind of, it's more like a window that you open. So taper takes 2 weeks to open the window, and then it stays open for about 2 weeks, and then after that the endurance adaptations that you've lost kick in, and you won't be able to perform like you were before. So here's where the different language comes in. So a drop taper, there's 2 ways to taper, right? You can take your yards and your intensity and you can drop them off a cliff, right? Go straight from 8,000 yards a day to, I don't know, 2,000. So drop tapers are fine for like those minor, so those in-season swim meets. They work better because we're only gonna do this for a couple days, and then we're gonna go back to heavy training. Whereas a gradual taper, you kind of slowly decrease your volume and a little bit of, or you maintain the intensity, but you slowly decrease the volume over a longer period of time, right? Your 2 weeks instead of 2 days. And actually in the science, what they noticed is that the gradual tapers actually work better than the drop tapers. But of course, because it takes so long, we only want to save them for when you have a big championship meet coming up. And finally, before ending, we want to talk about what not to do in taper, because this is a big problem. Kids get really anxious. They start worrying about their stroke. They start worrying about their dive, their turns, and all of a sudden they want to start practicing all these things a lot more. That's fine. You definitely need to focus on those details and practice them, but you don't want to overdo it. Remember, diving, turning is there's a lot of force and energy that's generated when you launch off the wall, and that's really a minor part of the swim of the race, but all that kind of force can damage muscles and prevent you from really maximizing your taper. So it's it's definitely something you want to practice throughout the season, and when you get to taper, you don't want to overdo it. Same with stretching, you don't want to overstretch. Just kind of maintain or decrease what you were doing throughout the season, but stretching itself can stretch the muscles beyond their limits and damage them. So you just want to do some light stretching just to maintain what you've built through the season. You don't want to gain flexibility, right? Your goal in taper should not be to gain flexibility. That should be something you've been doing before, and then in taper you just maintain. And then same thing, remember when we talked about specificity, the things that you do, or your body adapts only to what you do. And so throughout the season, you've been training all those motor units, those fibers, specifically for how you swim. If you start changing that at the end of the season, you're going to start using fibers and nerves that you did not train, and they are underdeveloped, so you're not going to swim as fast. New equipment will cause muscle damage, new dryland will cause muscle damage, so we definitely want to avoid these things. It's going to seem in your mind that this is what you should do to maximize your performance at the end of the season, but really the only thing you need to do when you maximize performance is do the exact same thing, but just less of it. And of course, always listen to your coach, and don't let the taper blues get to you. They're only temporary, and they will pass.